Path of Exile 2 is coming for Diablo 4. In the wake of Diablo 4 Season 1 falling flat on its face and the developers trying to win back goodwill with a stream and some responsive updates and hotfixes, Path of Exile is seemingly taking swings and aim at the ARPG giant. There are three things that I really want to look at, and before I jump into these three things, I've got the announcement of their beta, I've got an answer to a question where they're seemingly specifically trying to create a dividing line between them and Diablo, and I even have a good comparison of the class system. Before I get into that, I want to say, as somebody who has never played Path of Exile, and I've played all of the Diablos, I am actually more interested in Path of Exile 2 now after everything that I'm hearing, mainly because of my frustrations with Diablo 4 and what I really like about ARPGs, and I'm really interested in how they handle the seasons. They actually talk about one of the challenges of these types of games is seasons, and I've always said that is one of the more difficult things to get right, is the ongoing content model. So the first thing of the three things that I want to look at is they announced their closed beta, and the time frame is hilarious. And I have a Games Radar article we're going to kind of look at, because the author of this article is thinking the same thing that I'm thinking, that this was very intentional. This was not a coincidence. They're taking aim at Diablo 4. While Diablo 4 is down and out, they're like, hey, everybody, we know it's kind of rough over there. Here's when our closed beta is, and I'll give you the date because it's kind of funny. And then secondly, they answered a question and compared themselves to Diablo, and the way that they framed it, I think, really is taking aim at the state that Diablo 4 is in right now. Folks looking to play ARPGs will likely resonate and respond to what they're saying. And then they even had something to say about just the difficulty of seasonal content. And then lastly, I want to look at an opinion piece from Game Rant. So we've got Games Radar and we got Game Rant. Game Rant is saying that Path of Exile 2 will stand very tall against Diablo 4 in a very important category. And I think this again speaks to me and where I am, some of my boredom and some of my frustration with Diablo 4. And hearing this, input about Path of Exile 2 has me pretty excited. So first, let's just look at the closed beta. And again, this is hilarious, and this is from Games Radar. In what seems to be a strategically timed announcement, the highly anticipated action RPG sequel, Path of Exile 2, has set a June 7th, 2024 closed beta date, just as Diablo 4 stumbles through Season 1. Path of Exile developer Grinding Gear Games announced the beta at ExileCon, Path of Exile's aptly named BlizzCon alternative. Now, you didn't hear me wrong. June 7th of 2024. So at the time they made this announcement, like 11 months, 10 or 11 months, give or take, almost an entire year in advance. I don't know if in the history of closed betas or open betas, announcements about testing, I don't know if I've ever seen one announced basically a year ahead of time. This did seem to be, intentional. And the author of the article really thinks that this was an intentional thing, and they say the following: the more I think on it, the more I'm convinced that this is too perfect to be coincidental. Just the sheer time gap, almost a full year, between the announcement and the actual beta suggests to me that Grinding Gear saw an opportunity to strike while the prevailing king of ARPGs is momentarily down. After all, Diablo 4 only just launched less than 2 months ago, and that's still a wealth of time and opportunity to make a triumphant comeback. I completely agree with that. Diablo 4 certainly could turn things around. If Diablo 3, Loot 2.0, the seasonal format in Diablo 3, if that's any indication, they certainly can have a turnaround moment. I don't know how quickly that's going to happen. We know they're trying to respond. Now, I recently covered this. If you want to go watch my opening monologue, my live show, Diablo 4 is Getting Worse, I basically walk through how my larger concern with the state of Diablo 4 right now is that they are becoming reactionary. This is always the hardest thing to do in a live service game, is you make a mistake, you set things up wrong, things aren't quite ready, and you just start reacting, and that creates what I call a pendulum swing that always has completely unforeseen results. You're going to break things, hurt things, ruin things. You're going to create builds, you're going to create metas and problems because you're just sort of reacting right now. They're not being proactive. I didn't think their stream that they did, their fireside chat, I didn't feel like it gave me a whole lot of confidence. I didn't feel like, oh yeah, they really know what they're doing. It sort of felt like, how did you guys not see any of this coming? And now you're just sort of reacting. What's your vision for this game? What's your plan for this game? I remember being at a round table for Anthem, and as they were trying to get that game back on course, they were only really talking about content and new content. And it's like, okay, but where are you taking the game? What's your vision for the game? And I don't get a sense from the Diablo 4 developers that they have a very strong vision for where the game is supposed to go. I actually feel, and continue to feel, I did shows about this, there's a split identity. It's an MMO in disguise, and it also wants to be a seasonal ARPG. Funny enough, the second thing I want to look at, also from a Games Radar article, but it's from an IGN interview where they're talking about the game, and they sort of look at Diablo as if it is an MMO, but then people will ardently say it's not an MMO, it's an ARPG, and it's like, okay, well, everybody's looking at this game and can't really shake out what it's supposed to be. So here it says, in an interview with IGN, Jonathan Rogers talks about the upcoming game's leagues and how they'll differ to Diablo 4's seasons. And here he says, Blizzard certainly has a lot more around like cooldown rotations and things like that, but also just the more open world design and that kind of thing. Whereas we're going more in the kind of like Elden Ring sort of direction. It's much more action focused, but with a sort of hardcore bent. Okay. Now, before he said this, further up, right here it says, Path of Exile 2 will follow Elden Ring sort of direction rather than Diablo 4's, quote, MMO path, according to the game's director. So he's couching this as if, in his mind, that's more MMO. So they're viewing Diablo 4 in a similar way to the way that I viewed it. It's like, well, it's kind of an MMO in disguise. It's more open world. There's people in the open world. You have really low drop rates. It's really grindy. The leveling's really slow. They just slowed everything down. Those are all the tropes of an MMO. That doesn't feel like a fast action RPG where you're leveling quickly and you have a new character. And I don't necessarily know if Diablo 4 or the people playing it or the people defending it know what the game is supposed to be. Even people from the outside who are building an ARPG are looking at Diablo 4 and saying, well, we're going to be more action-oriented than them. They're doing this cooldown thing. It's open world. It's more MMO path. We're going more the action path. This speaks to me, okay? Because this feels very much targeted at Diablo 4 in its current state, like the author obviously saying, in case you missed it, we'd be surprised if you had, Blizzard hasn't had the easiest time with Diablo 4 Season 1 since its launch last month. So much so that developer had to have a candid thing telling fans we know it's bad, we know it's not fun, and that we don't plan on doing a patch like this ever again. So the author sees this answer very much sort of pressing in on this moment that, hey, they're in a bad spot. Everything's kind of slow. Action's not very good. We're going to focus more on the action. And this really speaks to me. This is all, I think, really amplified by the last thing we're going to look at in a moment where, Game Rant is arguing there's a huge difference between Diablo 4 and Path of Exile 2 that will really, I think, pull in folks like me who felt sort of burned by aspects of Diablo 4. But before we get to that, I wanted to look at one more thing from the same interview where Rogers sort of spoke to the struggles of seasonal content. This is a little bit more empathetic. Like, I feel like this quote is sort of resonating with like, hey, we know that's really hard. So on the topic of Diablo 4 struggles, Rogers said, the learning process for running a live game with seasons like this is a hard one. We've learned our lessons about how to do this stuff. Honestly, when I look at that, all I can think is, man, it's tough. It's a real tough situation to be in. Rogers then goes on to say, I feel very bad for the developers because I'm sure they mean well, but yeah, it's a hard lesson to learn. It is a hard lesson to learn. I've always said the greatest challenge facing live service games is elasticity and longevity. You can create really compelling characters, great voice acting. You can even have a really, really awesome content loop. but what am I going to be doing in the second month? What am I going to be doing in the 10th month? If you don't have good answers to those questions, how are the systems, the loot tables, the player incentivization, how is all of that going to have elasticity and longevity? One of the greatest challenges to loot-based live service games is they motivate you to play with loot. You get the loot, and you feel good about getting that loot. But then, month 2 rolls around, or season 1 lands, and they need to motivate you to chase more loot, which can invalidate the very loot you already have chased, creating a sense of a treadmill. This is always going to be a challenge. I don't think there's an easy answer, but if you don't have thoughtful and good answers to those questions, you, as Rogers points out here, you're going to learn those hard lessons. Your seasons, your ongoing content model will not do a very good job. And many people think that live service games are going to start stepping on each other's toes. We know that Last Epoch and Path of Exile are already in talks to navigate seasons so they don't step on each other's toes, sort of letting each other breathe, essentially. Like, hey, if we're both doing seasons at the exact same time, that seems sort of, like a lot of mutual self-destruction, so why don't we sort of share the dance room floor? I think that's a pretty good strategy, because live service games, especially ones that are very similar like this, like Last Epoch, Path of Exile 2, and Diablo 4, you are very much appealing to a player base that has a lot in common, and then they can only play one game at a time, right? And if you're demanding a ton of their time and a ton of their grinding, then they're going to have a hard time giving you any of their attention. So it'll be interesting to see where Diablo 4 ends up with longevity, elasticity, with their ongoing content model, but I want to look at this last thing, because Game Rant thinks that Path of Exile 2 versus Diablo 4 with respect to classes is a clear advantage to Path of Exile 2. So let's take a look at this article. It says here, Diablo 4 classes all have a refined identity that translates into unique abilities and gameplay mechanics, which makes experiencing the game through all of them all the more appealing. Path of Exile 2 does the same thing, this time around making some skills exclusive to one class, which gives each class its time in the limelight. But that's not all. Not only does Path of Exile 2 have 3 ascendancy classes for each character class, but it sports a whopping total of 12 base classes to choose from against the 5 of Diablo 4. Now, we'll look at the second paragraph in just a second. One of my issues with Diablo 4 was the linear leveling within the skill tree. From level 16 to like level 26, I really didn't feel like anything changed. You're sort of adding percentages to abilities that you've already unlocked. Now, Diablo 3, I've consistently said my memory of Diablo 3 leveling is a lot more positive, because I would stop using a certain ability, and then I'd be leveling, I'd hit a certain ding, oh cool, I'd be like, oh, I just unlocked a rune for an ability I've not been using for a really long time. Let me loop back and kind of test that out. So there wasn't this sort of settled build so early in the game. And Riker tried to warn us about this. He said, listen, your damage dealer at the beginning, you're going to be using that from level 25 all the way to 100. That's 75 levels of basically using the same abilities in a general sense. Now, I know that once you start to get legendary aspects, it can really change the feel of your build. It really can make you feel a little bit more powerful, but that doesn't really mean that there aren't narrow, unidimensional feels to the characters. Now, when I hear there's ascendancy classes and there's 12 base classes in Path of Exile, I'm like, okay, you have my attention. Not only are you saying you're going to be more action-oriented than Diablo 4, but you're also giving me what sounds like a lot more of build choices. Now, one of the reasons I've stayed away from Path of Exile up to now is I've seen the spreadsheets, okay? I've seen them. Don't act like they don't exist, okay? You guys that love Path of Exile, I love you. Your commitment and your passion's admirable, but I don't have time for that, okay? I don't have time for Excel spreadsheets. I need to click a couple of things, navigate a couple of choices, and have a build that's fun and rewarding. And Path of Exile 2, from everything I've seen, seems to be setting their sights on being more approachable in that regard. It's not going to be this, pull out your spreadsheet. It's crunch numbers time. But beyond having just a lot of base classes, listen to what they say here in the second paragraph. This is a clear advantage Path of Exile 2 has over Diablo 4 because of the sheer diversity each class will have in the incredible replay value of the title, with ascendancy classes further shaping up what a given character can do, branching in 3 different paths. This virtually means Path of Exile 2 has 48 classes total, although only 12 of them will actually have different skills to unlock. Players can still expect the same passive skill tree concept from the original, however, with it being shared across all classes, unlike Diablo 4. So they see this as a clear advantage. And the boring sense that I got in Diablo 4, it feels as though Path of Exile has a direct answer against that. Now, I don't know if with all that diversity, will I still feel like I've settled into a build early on in Path of Exile? I don't know. I don't mind settling into a build in the end game, but settling into a build in like level 19 or 20 when there's 100 levels, it just felt a little early for that. And I know things change when you hit 50 and you get the Paragon boards, but I wasn't seeing anything tectonic. And honestly, if the road from the 20s to the 50s is paved with just the same abilities over and over again, and then there was the damage resistance scaling going up, like the higher you level, the more the enemies resist you, and it tends to slow down the action. I think resistance scaling makes way more sense in the end game. It doesn't make sense in base leveling. It doesn't make sense in the campaign. It doesn't even make sense in World Tier 1. I've talked about that time and time again. It made the game feel very boring. So Path of Exile 2 seems to be coming for Diablo 4, and it may be coming for me. I may actually have to check this thing out. I may have to do some streams about it, maybe talk with you guys that are from that community. Leave some comments below. Let me know. You guys all seem to be very welcoming and very aggressive. You really want players to play Path of Exile, and I always like people who are out here proselytizing for your favorite video games. You know, you're out here evangelizing for your favorite games, and I always like that, and everybody seems to be very helpful. Now, these uploads usually roll over into a members-only debrief. That's a great reason to be a member here. You may have gotten a gifted membership. Consider upgrading so that way you're not always getting a gifted. Maybe take care of the membership on your own. If you can't do a membership, watch as often as you can. It'll increase your chances. Hit the like button, hit the share button, hit that subscribe button so I can see you in the next video.